Welcome to the deep dive. We are jumping straight into a really complex, century-old legal issue today. It's one that, well, according to the research we've looked at, places this huge, kind of quiet burden on American citizens living in Puerto Rico. We're talking about the Merchant Marine Act in 1920. You probably know it better as the Jones Act. Now, this law was meant to protect domestic shipping, right? But for Puerto Rico, being a U.S. territory out in the ocean, our sources are basically arguing it acts less like protection and more like, well, an economic stranglehold. So our mission here in this deep dive is to pull together the main arguments, the strongest claims from this legal and economic challenge. We want to get beyond just what the Jones Act is and really dig into why its application to Puerto Rico is seen by critics as, politically arbitrary, economically just devastating, and maybe even constitutionally shaky.
And we have to start with a basic fact. Puerto Rico depends heavily on imports. We're talking over 85% of the goods consumed there. The Jones Act, it lays down these strict rules for any goods shipped between two U.S. ports. And this restriction, it creates this enormous cost difference. It's quite striking.
Yeah, the initial shock factor, it's pretty clear when you look at the numbers. Studies keep showing that Puerto Rico pays way, way more for essential things like food, fuel, medicine, compared to nearby islands in the Caribbean that aren't U.S. territories.
Right.
We're looking at shipping costs that can be, well, more than double what places like the Dominican Republic or Jamaica pay. For similar goods, crossing the same waters, it's a huge difference.
Double the cost.
Yeah.
Just based on the ship's flag, its crew, and where it was built. That's the barrier we're talking about. Okay, let's break down those 4 rules you mentioned. If a ship is moving goods from, say, Jacksonville down to San Juan, what exactly are the rules? The non-negotiables the Jones Act enforces, lawyers call it cabotage, right? That's right, cabotage. It just means regulating trade within a country's own waters. And under the Jones Act, there are 4 key things any ship in domestic trade has to meet. No exceptions. First, it has to be built in the U.S. Second, owned by U.S. citizens. Third, crewed primarily by U.S. citizens or permanent residents. And fourth, it needs to be registered under the U.S. flag.
Okay. And for the mainland U.S., the argument is, this protects key industries, keeps shipyards going, ensures there's a pool of mariners for defense needs. But apply that same logic to an island territory, hundreds of miles offshore. What does that actually mean in practice? What's the real-world impact?
The impact is a severely limited market. The sources really paint a picture of artificial scarcity. Instead of global competition keeping prices down, Puerto Rico is stuck with this small, often quite old, and very expensive fleet of ships that meet the Jones Act rules. And that scarcity, it lets the few carriers who do qualify charge premium rates. They know the island doesn't really have another legal option for getting goods from the mainland.
Okay, let's move from the general idea to some actual numbers. How does this bottleneck translate into dollars and cents for the economy there? What are the estimates on those inflated import costs?
Well, the numbers are pretty stark. It basically acts like a hidden tax on, well, everything that comes onto the island. Various reports, economic analyses we've seen, they estimate Puerto Rico's overall import costs are pushed up by something like 20 to 40%. Solely because of the Jones Act.
20 to 40%.
Yeah,
Wow.
think about what that means. Not just for big purchases like a car, but for everyday groceries. It hits lower income residents the hardest, obviously, and it means local businesses start off at a major disadvantage compared to competitors elsewhere.
So that 20–40% is just baked into the price of almost everything. And this is where the law goes beyond just inflating prices into, well, creating situations that seem completely absurd. The example of liquefied natural gas, LNG, really highlights this, doesn't it? It seems like inefficiency written into law.
It really is the peak of irrationality, you could say. The U.S. mainland, it's become this huge exporter of natural gas. There's a domestic surplus, yet Puerto Rico, a U.S. territory, cannot legally buy that cheap U.S. gas. Why? Because there are literally 0 Jones Act compliant LNG tankers operating today? None.
0?
Yeah.
Why not? Is it just too expensive to build those specialized tankers in American shipyards?
That's exactly it. Building something complex like an LNG tanker in a U.S. yard costs vastly more than in, say, South Korea or other major shipbuilding nations, which are often heavily subsidized. So the math just doesn't work for a U.S. carrier to spend billions on a U.S.-built tanker. They could buy a foreign-built one for much less, but those foreign ships are banned from the Puerto Rico route under the Jones Act.
So the law, which is supposed to help U.S. shipbuilding, forces Puerto Rico to skip U.S. natural gas altogether and instead buy more expensive LNG from foreign countries like Trinidad and Tobago, just to keep the lights on. It makes absolutely no sense from an economic
Huh.
standpoint.
Right. It forces the territory into paying much more for energy. That destabilizes their power grid, makes the whole island less productive, all while being technically part of the world's biggest natural gas producer. It's a paradox.
And in this underlying vulnerability, it becomes truly dangerous in a crisis.
Mhm.
We all remember Hurricane Maria in 2017, just devastating. The federal government eventually, after some delay, issued a temporary waiver,
Yeah.
allowed foreign ships with aid to dock.
They did, yes. But, and this is crucial, that moment of relief, it only lasted 10 days.
10 days, that's it.
10 days. Then the waiver expired, and the Jones Act snapped right back into place. It's important because it shows the law can be waived. Congress has that power. But back in 2017, the political pressure from the maritime industry to reinstate the law quickly apparently outweighed the need for sustained, flexible relief efforts. It really highlighted how this is a policy choice, a mechanism that holds firm even in the face of, well, basic survival needs. That 10-day limit says a lot.
That really puts it into perspective. How can a U.S. law be applied so differently, almost arbitrarily? And that brings us right to the heart of the legal challenge, this unjust comparison. Why is Puerto Rico bound by the Jones Act when the U.S. Virgin Islands, right next door practically, are fully exempt?
That's the really fascinating part, legally speaking. The difference isn't based on some fundamental constitutional reason, like statehood versus territory status. It's purely a result of a congressional policy decision made way back. The sources are clear. Congress absolutely has the power to grant Puerto Rico the same exemption. They did it for the USVI back in 1936. It's a matter of political will, not legal impossibility.
But the USVI got their exemption decades ago, and Puerto Rico's requests keep getting shot down. So you have to ask, what's the political machinery keeping this law in place for Puerto Rico, despite all the economic damage we've discussed? Who benefits enough to fight so hard to maintain it?
Well, it's a classic case of concentrated benefits versus diffused costs. The benefits of keeping the Jones Act for Puerto Rico go to a pretty small but very well-resourced group. We're talking about the few U.S. shipping companies that service the island, the U.S. shipyards that might occasionally build a relevant ship, and importantly, the powerful maritime unions. They've built up really strong lobbying operations in D.C. over the years, and they often use the national security argument to defend what is effectively an economic monopoly for them.
Right, the national security argument. That's the main defense you hear, isn't it? They argue we need active U.S. shipyards and a ready pool of American sailors for emergencies, for wartime mobilization. Do the sources push back on that justification?
They do, specifically in the context of Puerto Rico. The argument kind of falls apart there. Because if national security was the absolute top priority, why are the U.S. Virgin Islands, which are also strategically located, totally exempt? It doesn't quite add up. Plus, the U.S. military already relies heavily on foreign-flagged ships for its global logistics anyway. So applying the Jones Act rigidly to Puerto Rico seems more about protecting certain commercial interests than a unique national defense need that couldn't be met other ways, like through direct subsidies or specific military contracts if needed.
And this all loops back to Puerto Rico's political status, right? Since the territory doesn't have voting members in Congress, the massive economic pain it endures is, as our sources put it, sort of politically invisible to those powerful lobbying interests in Washington.
Exactly. The law was designed by mainland interests, really for mainland interests, and it's kept alive by their political influence. When you impose such a financially burdensome regulation on millions of U.S. citizens without their full consent or the voting power to effectively fight back against that lobbying, it just raises these deep questions about fairness and, well, democratic representation.
That lack of representation is a perfect bridge to the core constitutional arguments being made against the Jones Act's application here. The legal challenge basically says this isn't just bad policy. It might be legally indefensible under the Constitution itself. What's the first angle?
The first, and maybe the most straightforward one, is the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause. By treating U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico differently from U.S. citizens in the neighboring U.S. Virgin Islands, denying one group access to global shipping rates while giving it to the other without a really compelling reason, critics argue Congress has created this kind of tiered system of rights. American citizens paying significantly more just based on which island territory they live on. It feels unequal.
That unequal treatment argument seems pretty strong on its face. What about the Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8? That's supposed to ensure free trade within the U.S., right?
Right. The Commerce Clause challenge focuses on how the Jones Act creates these artificial barriers to trade. The law literally blocks foreign ships from bringing U.S. goods to Puerto Rico. And, crucially, It also stops those ships from picking up Puerto Rican exports to take elsewhere efficiently. This kills competition, limits market access, and critics say it violates that core principle of free interstate commerce. It effectively isolates Puerto Rico's economy from the broader U.S. system in a way that wasn't intended.
And then the representation problem we talked about that ties into the Fifth Amendment's due process clause.
That's the third angle, yes. The due process argument. It comes back to that fundamental American idea. No taxation or regulation without representation. Since Puerto Ricans don't have voting members in Congress to represent their interests when laws like this are made or kept, imposing this incredibly costly regulation without their consent raises serious questions. It's like levying a massive hidden tax on people who have no real way to vote out the politicians responsible for it.
But what's perhaps encouraging, as the sources point out, is that this seems like a problem that can be fixed. It's rooted in policy decisions, not some unchangeable part of the law. And that 1936 exemption for the USVI serves as clear proof, a legal precedent, that making this change for Puerto Rico is entirely possible and legal.
Absolutely. That precedent is probably the strongest argument reformers have. It demonstrates that the national security claims, while raised, can be overridden by Congress when it chooses to act. The law itself is flexible. It's the political will that's been the obstacle.
Okay, so let's address a counter-argument you sometimes hear from Jones Act supporters. The idea that maybe Puerto Rico isn't ready, that its ports couldn't handle a sudden influx of international shipping if the act were lifted. Is that accurate?
That argument doesn't really hold water, according to the sources we reviewed. The issue isn't capacity. It's that the existing capacity is underutilized because of the Jones Act. They point to major ports like the Port of San Juan, already one of the busiest container ports in the whole Caribbean, and the Port of Ponce, which is a modern deep-water facility. These ports are not just ready. They're capable of handling significantly more traffic, more foreign vessels, more global containers. They're essentially waiting for the restrictions to be lifted.
So if the legal arguments against it are strong, the precedent exists, and the infrastructure is actually ready and waiting, what would the immediate economic forecast look like? What are the projected benefits if, say, tomorrow, the Jones Act restrictions were removed for Puerto Rico?
The change could be pretty dramatic and quite fast. First off, you'd likely see shipping costs drop almost immediately, aiming towards that 20 to 40% reduction we talked about, the whole LNG absurdity. That ends. Puerto Rico could finally access cheaper U.S. natural gas, which would be huge for lowering electricity costs across the island. That affects everyone. And think about exports. Puerto Rico is a major global center for pharmaceutical manufacturing. Lower costs for importing materials and exporting finished products would give that vital industry a significant boost.
So the ultimate vision here isn't just about lowering costs, it's about fundamentally changing Puerto Rico's position, turning its geography from a disadvantage into a real regional advantage.
Exactly. If freed from these constraints, Puerto Rico is perfectly located geographically. It could become a vital maritime bridge, a logistics hub connecting the U.S. East Coast, the rest of the Caribbean, and Latin America. Ending the Jones Act restrictions could transform what's now an economic vulnerability into a significant geopolitical and supply chain asset, benefiting not just the island, but the wider U.S. economy, too.
So to quickly recap the core argument we've unpacked, the economic harm seems severe and well-documented. The legal contradictions are pretty glaring, especially that USVI comparison, and the island itself appears ready for the change. Which brings us back to the political reality, something the sources touch on. The role of the diaspora.
Yes, the advocacy strategy is shifting. The materials emphasize the growing political consciousness and potential clout of the millions of Puerto Ricans living on the mainland, particularly those in key states like Florida, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Texas. They represent a potentially powerful voting bloc. They're the ones who can make this economic pain visible to members of Congress who might otherwise only hear from the well-funded maritime lobby. It's about translating economic data into political pressure.
And this challenge, framed by legal precedent and economic readiness, isn't really about asking for a handout or special treatment, is it?
No, and that's the absolutely critical final point to underscore. This isn't Puerto Rico asking for charity or some kind of preferential deal. It's framed as a demand for a correction, for the removal of what critics see as an arbitrary, damaging, self-inflicted restriction that makes millions of American citizens poorer simply because of where they live.
Which leaves us with, I think, a really provocative thought to consider. The ongoing application of the Jones Act to Puerto Rico isn't just some dusty legal loophole waiting to be tidied up. It's presented here as an active legal battleground, where fundamental questions about equal economic justice and representation for all U.S. citizens are being tested every single day.